Last time, I started talking about how to avoid the mistake of going into a guitar-oriented session without a thorough enough working knowledge of the kind of details that you'd need to not only dial up the best, most appropriate distortion from both real and virtual amps, but also interact with guitarists and guitar-centric producers when it comes to at least some of the minutiae of guitar amp distortion. After describing the basic signal flow of a guitar amp, preamp tubes, tone stack, power amp tubes, I mentioned that certain different amp types and amp models were associated with certain classic sounds, certain specific qualities of distortion, and how anyone working sessions that involved either real amps or modeled virtual amps would do well to have at least a basic familiarity with the most well-known examples. Well, here's a very brief rundown of some of the basic categories of guitar amps, the specific tubes they're associated with, and the particular distortion characteristics of those tubes, and a few of the classic and most popular brands that tend to serve as templates for most other designs. I'll break amp types up into 4 categories based on their distinctive sound and design. In most cases, it's the power amp tubes that may be most responsible for the most distinctive distortion characteristics of each. 2 classic American amp sounds are associated with vintage Fender amps. They mostly use the same 12AX7 or sometimes 12AY7 preamp tubes. The older Tweed models from the 50s feature 6V6 power tubes, a low wattage tube which produces an edgy, kind of snarly distortion. The later 60s Fender Blackface models, named for the control panel, changed circuit designs and switched to higher wattage 6L6 power tubes. These have a smoother, kind of fat distortion, though these amps are equally associated with clean, bright tones, usually described as glassy. Two different vintage British amp brands both offer up a very different distortion character. Marshall amps utilize the same preamp tubes, though the British version, the ECC83, but they use EL34 power tubes, a British Pento that overloads with a much more mid-rangey, crunchy quality, which has long been associated with classic rock distortion tones. Vox amps have a more unique distortion, usually ascribed to the combination of smaller EL84 power tubes and Class A operation of the output tubes. Most amps run as Class AB. Class A is known for being free of a certain type of crossover distortion. This has led people to describe the distortion in Vox amps as so-called clean distortion that lets individual notes and chords come through with more clarity than with many other amp designs. Most of these vintage models have only one gain knob, though some amp modelers may always include a master volume output gain as well. If the original didn't have it, and you want to be as faithful as possible to that sound, I'd leave the extra master volume at maximum and work with the input drive knob. Now, these amps, though designed many years ago, still serve as the templates for most current amps, both hardware and software, so if you're familiar enough with them and their sounds, you should be in pretty good shape for most guitar-oriented sessions. More modern, aggressive distortion tones can be had from Mesa Boogie amps. Their cascading preamp gain stages were an innovation that became the model for modern high-gain amp design, and it lends them a buzzier, though still full-sounding distortion. Other aspects of the design, plus common tone settings, tend to emphasize the highs and lows of the distorted signal, leading to the common characterization of that sound as scooped, referring to the scooped-out, attenuated mid-range. Kind of the opposite of the more mid-rangey emphasis of classic vintage Marshall distortion. Both preamp and power amp gain knobs are included, so you can fine-tune the balance of the buzzier preamp and crunchier power amp distortion characteristics. So, if you need to emulate a certain amp model or type of distortion that's not included in your virtual arsenal, you can probably get at least part of the way there by choosing an amp with a similar design and tube complement. Some of the tweakier amp sims even let you design your own amp at the component level, though if you're that knowledgeable about amp circuitry, you probably didn't need to go through this basic primer. I want to wrap up this discussion of different distortion tones with a mention of the effect of the tone stack and the speaker cabinet on distortion quality. Harmonic distortion is a wide-range signal, producing distortion harmonics that extend up to some fairly high frequencies. This could make for a very bright, fairly harsh sound if heard without the mellowing effect of a typical guitar amp speaker cabinet. Guitar amp cabinets have only mid-range speakers in them. 10-inch and 12-inch are the most common size, and no tweeters. This superimposes a band-limited, mid-range emphasized tone on the distorted sound coming out of the amplifier section. Without this, that same wonderful grind and crunch might be a nastier, edgier buzz. In fact, sometimes one of the most distinctive aspects of a particular amp's overall tone is a result of the specific frequency response of its matching speaker cabinet. Each speaker has a resonant peak, and those peaks help define the unique tone of that cabinet. And with those cabinets that have multiple speakers, typically 2 or 4, the phase interference between the speakers can also color the tone in a beneficial way. That's why most amp sims feature mix and match cabinets and virtual mics that can be freely positioned, and adjusting these parameters can often have as much effect on the tone and distortion quality as playing with the tone knobs. You can often get a whole new range of sounds simply by swapping out cabinets. This is commonly done in the real world as well, but of course it's way easier with modeled amps. The tone stack, typically some combination of bass, mid-range, treble, and presence, which is high treble, can affect not only overall tone, but distortion tone as well. Large tonal changes ahead of the distortion can produce a noticeably different result than if those tone controls followed that circuit. If you have one of those amp sims that lets you mess with the internal design of the virtual circuit, you could experiment with this. Some plugins that feature generic controls for the user to sculpt their own distortion sounds may offer options in this regard, like this clip distortion plugin that comes with Logic. It has multiple filters at different stages in the signal flow, and you can get a lot of distinctly different types of distortion by trying out different combinations of settings. Now, so far I've been focusing more on don'ts that involve the use of virtual amps, but next time I'll get into one that addresses the use of real amps on already recorded tracks: reamping.